While people are joining us, I will briefly introduce the session and the speakers. I am Larry Diamond with Hisham Salam, who you also see on the screen here. We lead the program on Arab Reform and Democracy at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford. We've had the pleasure before of hosting the two principal investigators of the extraordinary social science research project, the Arab Barometer. We feel extremely fortunate to be able to do so again because of the sobering importance of Arab public opinion, and more especially Palestinian public opinion, at this crisis-ridden moment, and the unique coincidence of the Arab Barometer completing its 8th wave survey in Palestine shortly before the October 7th attacks on Israel. I'd like now to introduce our two speakers who will be presenting the evidence from the survey that they conducted in Palestine a few weeks ago. Amaney Jamal, who will join us shortly, is the Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and the Edward S. Sanford Professor of Politics and Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University. She directs the workshop on Arab political development and the BOPST AUB Collaborative Initiative, and is a former president of the Association of Middle Eastern Women's Studies. The focus of her current research is on the drivers of political behavior in the Arab world, Muslim immigration to the US and Europe, and the effect of inequality and poverty on political outcomes. She's very widely published. Her books include Barriers to Democracy in 2007 and Of Empires and Citizens, published by Princeton University Press in 2012, as well as many edited books as well. And her co-edited books include Citizenship and Crisis, Arab Detroit after 9/11. Michael Robbins is the director and with Amaney, principal investigator of the Arab Barometer. He's been a part of that research network since its inception and has served as its director since 2014. He has led or overseen more than 100 surveys in international contexts and is a leading expert in survey methods on ensuring data quality. And I might add, the Arab Barometer is highly regarded for its data quality. His work on Arab public opinion, political Islam, and political parties has been published in numerous journals, including Comparative Political Studies, the Journal of Conflict Resolution and Foreign Affairs, and I'm proud to say that we have published Michael and Amaney both on multiple occasions in the Journal of Democracy. So Amaney and Michael, thank you so much for joining the Arab Reform and Democracy program again, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Larry and Hisham, for having us. It's a great pleasure and opportunity to be here. What we're going to do is present some of our findings from Palestine, especially from Gaza, right before the October 7th attacks. So we're going to start with an overview of the Arab Barometer. The Arab Barometer is a nonpartisan research network that provides insight into social, political, and economic attitudes and values of ordinary citizens across the Arab world. The Arab Barometer is the longest standing and largest repository of publicly available data on ordinary citizens' views in MENA. And the Arab Barometer's mission is to track attitudes and behavior, build institutional capacity, and to disseminate knowledge about ordinary citizens living in the Middle East and North Africa. Up to date, we've conducted more than 125,000 personal interviews. We've conducted 89 nationally representative surveys, We've conducted 8 waves of surveys across 16 countries, providing trend data on how views have changed over time. We've disaggregated data, which allows for both inter and intra-country comparisons. And the data are open source and publicly available for analysis at the Barometer.org. And we have country and topical reports, including the one that has findings discussed today, and also available for download in both English and Arabic. This last Wave 8 survey of Palestinians was conducted around a time period about 3 weeks, right before the October 6th, 7th attacks. It was fielded from September 28th to October 8th. It is a representative survey of 1,189 Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, ages 18 and above. It was conducted in person, face-to-face in the respondent's place of residence. It's based on an area probability sample, but like with all our surveys, we're able to sort of anchor against census data to make sure that the area probability sample is representative. It's a complex survey design stratified by governorate and level of urbanity. Again, fielded from September 28th to October 8th, and the field work was conducted by the Palestine Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is known as PCPSR, head by Dr. Khalid Shikaki. So just to give you a few overview slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Robbins, the Arab-Israeli conflict. So by and large, when we ask Palestinians about their views towards normalization between Arab states and Israel, what we find is that there's very little support for normalization. 68% oppose it with another 68% strongly oppose it with another 25% opposing it. We only see about 7% support for normalization between Israel and the Arab world. And when we break this down by the West Bank and Gaza, you actually find that the West Bank Palestinians are even more strongly opposed than the Gaza residents. Here we believe it's all about the two-state solution. What role will the West Bank play in a final status peace solution, if you may? It does appear that normalization is proceeding ahead of the two-state solution. West Bank Palestinians feel that they're going to be left out of the equation. The preferred solution to the peace process, when we ask Palestinians, what is the preferred solution? Here we focus on 3 responses: a two-state solution based on 1967 borders, a one-state solution, or a confederation. You see the majority of Palestinians support a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. We found slightly more support for that in Gaza than among West Bank Palestinians. We also allowed for a 4th option here, which is other. You'll see that 25% of Palestinians indicated other and were able to write in their response. Those 25% wrote in armed resistance. So we have in the general Palestinian survey, 1 in 4 Palestinians saying they believe in armed resistance. Among the Gaza population, it's 1 in 5, 20%. When we ask Palestinians their views on the role of the US and China in addressing the Arab-Israeli conflict, what we find is that the majority of Palestinians believe both are bad, the plurality, the most frequent plurality, 37% believe both are bad, but more Palestinians believe that China has better policies towards the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than does the US. So that's 26% to 13%. 16% believe that both are equally good. When we break this down by geographic region, what we find is that Gazans slightly believe the US is better on this issue than China. West Bankers believe China is better on this issue than the US, and there we believe it has more to do with the settlement expansion and the what is perceived to be the lack of a U.S. policy condemning those settlement expansions into the West Bank. Gazans are more likely to believe that both are good. About a quarter of Gazans believe both China and the U.S. are good. but about 40% of West Bankers believe both are equally bad. Economic conditions. One of the things that we track over time, which we think is really important in this context, is to track people's attitudes about the economic situation. When we ask people about the current economic situation in the country, you'll see here among the Palestinians, a good percentage, almost 80% believe the economic situation is bad or very bad. And when we break this down by geographic region, you'll see that 55% of Gazans say it's very bad, and another 38% say it's bad. Only 6% of Gazans say the economic situation is good. So looking at where these economic assessments stood right before the October 7th attacks, the devastating majority of Gazans say that the economic situation is bad or very bad. When we ask about prospective attitudes about the economy, what are the prospects of like economic improvement? Do you believe the economic situation in the country will improve in the coming years? What you see is that, again, the majority of Palestinians, 56% believe it will be somewhat worse or much worse. For Gazans, about 48% believe it will be somewhat worse or much worse. There seems to be some optimism that things might get better. 18% of Palestinians do believe things will get better, but about 21% of Gazans believe that. So there is some level of optimism. It's not earth-shattering. It's a minority of the population, but the majority does believe that things will get much worse. Most important challenge facing the country, and here we list a variety of issues. You'll see that the economic situation is the most pressing among those issues. We also mentioned corruption, instability, settler terrorism that really pertains to the West Bank. So you'll see when we break it down geographically, Gazans are much more likely to cite the economic situation. 41% basically say it's a priority. Corruption, instability, state terrorism, settler terrorism for the West Bankers is quite significant. It's almost as equal as every other indicator. So 21% of West Bankers said the economic situation, and 20% said settler terrorism, meaning that the number of attacks by settlers against West Bank Palestinians has been on the rise, to the extent that it's just as egregious as the economic situation. Corruption is a major factor in both the West Bank and Gaza. We see that about 85% of Palestinians believe that corruption in state institutions and national agencies is prevalent to a large extent or to a medium extent. This perception is slightly larger on the West Bank vis-a-vis the PA than it is vis-a-vis the Hamas regime, but nevertheless, 72% of Palestinians in Gaza believe that there is corruption to a large extent, to a medium extent, in the institutions and national agencies of the regime. Tackling corruption, do Palestinians believe that their governing regimes are doing enough to tackle corruption? The majority believe that the governments are doing this well to a small extent or not at all. So again, that's about 61% in the West Bank and Gaza believe this. On the West Bank, about 62% believe the government is tackling corruption well, to some extent or not at all. And that compares to 57% of the Palestinians in Gaza. So again, among Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, they believe corruption is rampant and the governments are doing very little to address corruption. Availability of food. These are some of the questions that we ask about food security. So the question basically asks, do you believe that the availability of food, or the lack of food, is that a problem? Is it currently a problem for you in our surveys? And about 68% said yes, it's a problem to a medium or to a great extent. you'll see that in Gaza, that number is higher than the 68%. So in Gaza, about 78% say that food, the availability of food is currently a problem to a great extent, to a medium extent. And that percentage is much larger than what we see on the West Bank. In fact, this percentage is much larger than what we saw in wave 7 of the data. And I think we're going to say a little bit more about that in the subsequent slide. Affordability of food, is the affordability of food a problem? Again, about 78% of Palestinians say it's a problem to a great and to a medium extent. And the percentage saying that the affordability of food is a current problem is almost comparable between the West Bank and Gaza, although we see that Gaza Palestinians are more likely to sort of cite this as a problem, with about 74% or 75% of the population saying it's a problem. And when we get really to the food insecurity question, the food that we bought did not last, and we did not have money to get more. Has this been true? What we see is that 17% of Palestinians say that this is true, 41% say this is often true or sometimes true, and 42% say it's never true. So this means about 58% of the total Palestinian population is confronting some sort of food insecurity issue. When we break this down by region, what we find is that you really do see that this is a problem in Gaza, where about 75% say that it is often true or sometimes true that they ran out of food and they could not afford to buy more food in the previous 30-day period. That's 3 in 4 individuals in Gaza saying that they're facing the challenge of food insecurity. When we compare that to Wave 7, which was conducted in 2021, so only 2 years earlier, that percentage stood at 51%. So we've seen almost a 25% growth in food insecurity in Gaza under the Hamas-led regime during this time period right before October 7th. Political conditions, and I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Michael Robbins.
So thanks so much, Amaney. It's great to be here to share a bit more about kind of the political conditions and looking at some other trends we've seen. What we see is that we ask a question for those living in the West Bank if they have trust in the government of the West Bank, as well as a separate question for those in Gaza who say they have trust in Gaza. What we can see is that there's a very low percentage who's saying they have trust in either. No trust at all is the majority in the West Bank, and in Gaza it's the plurality, 44%. Only 29% say they have a great deal or quite a lot of trust in Gaza, compared to 18% in the West Bank. So overall, what we see is that there's a very low level of support for institutions, whether it be the PA or the Hamas-led government, that the Palestinians don't feel that any of their leaders are really legitimate in this sense. Part of this really comes down to government responsiveness. And so where we have is asking the percent who say that the government is either very or largely responsive to their needs. And only 1 in 5 Palestinians overall says that the government is responsive, whether it be that in the Gaza or the West Bank. And you can see some of the differences here. We do see that the government, the Hamas-led government in Gaza, is slightly more seen as slightly more responsive, 26% compared to 17% in the West Bank. But overall, this is still very low. Only about a quarter at most in either of the two, West Bank or Gaza, say that the government is responsive to their needs. When we ask a straight-up question about trust in Hamas, we see that only 23% say they have a great deal or quite a lot of trust in this. In fact, or about half, just over half, 52% say they have no trust at all in Hamas as an organization. When we break that down, we see that trust is a bit lower for Hamas in the West Bank. 56% say they have no trust at all in Hamas in the West Bank, compared to 44%. Trust is slightly higher for Hamas in Gaza, 29% overall saying that they have some trust in Hamas, which is basically the same as trust in the government itself. So we do see some slight differences here, but overall, Hamas is not widely supported by Palestinians living in Gaza or the West Bank. If we turn to Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, currently in, I think, the 19th year of his 4-year term, we see that there's a very low levels of trust. No trust at all is at 56%, the majority of Palestinians saying that. And again, both in Gaza and the West Bank, at least half say that they have no trust at all in Mahmoud Abbas at this point. So thinking about having him or potentially as a solution to the conflict currently raging in Gaza, what we can see is that there's very little support for having him step in either in the West Bank or in Gaza, that he has very low levels of confidence. When we turn to party affiliation, we do see that there is, in effect, relatively weak party support for any one party. In fact, 1 in 5, or just under a quarter, 22%, say that they have no party affiliation or no party that they feel closest to. Fatah comes out as the most popular, 30%, Hamas at 21%. Don't know, refuse is also fairly high at 14%. So overall, we see about 35% of Palestinians saying that they don't have a party that represents them well at this point. When you break that down, we see that Fatah is evenly supported in the West Bank and in Gaza. Hamas has somewhat higher support in Gaza than the West Bank, 27 to 17%. But overall, there's not a strong party that is winning the hearts and minds of the majority of Palestinians overall. Part of the issue that we're seeing as well is that the challenges that citizens are facing in terms of their basic freedoms. That certainly most Palestinians say that either their freedoms to speech is guaranteed to a limited or extent or no extent at all. Only about a third overall say that they have this guaranteed to a great or medium extent. What is interesting is that this is certainly strong in the West Bank of those saying that they don't have the freedom to express opinions. About half in the West Bank say that this is not guaranteed at all, compared to about half or about a quarter in Gaza. But again, overall, in both environments, in Gaza, only 40% say they're enjoying freedom to express opinions, compared to about 27% in the West Bank. So certainly these basic rights are a big problem in both Gaza and the West Bank. We asked about the freedom to demonstrate peacefully. Is this guaranteed or not? We saw some small protests against Hamas in the summer, a few months before the conflict, the attacks, and then the subsequent conflict. What we find is that overall, Palestinians are unlikely to say this is guaranteed to a great or medium extent. Only 27% overall. Again, those living in the West Bank are actually saying that this is a greater problem. Those who say it's not guaranteed at all in the West Bank, 51% compared to 35%. But overall, part of this is just a sense of degree. To a limited extent in Gaza is 33%, 22% in the West Bank. But overall, we don't see a huge difference in those who say it is guaranteed to a great or medium extent in the two places. So this basic right is something that Palestinians don't feel that they have guaranteed on the whole. The same is really true for freedom of the press. We see that about 42% of minority say that it's guaranteed to a great or medium extent. And again, this is somewhat, the percent saying it's not guaranteed at all is a bit higher by 16 points in the West Bank compared with Gaza. But overall, this is, again, something that is a concern that basically freedom of the press is not seen as guaranteed by Palestinians. So as we move beyond thinking about domestic conditions, economic and political, and views of the conflict, we want to think a bit more about what people are saying about foreign powers. Again, this is all done before the conflict broke out, and so this may have changed as a result. However, we did want to think a bit more about who has some legitimacy, who are Palestinians looking to as potentially someone who could, outside powers that might be brokers, help find a peace or a peaceful solution to the current situation. What we find is very low levels of support for the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. is playing a leading role right now. The Burns is in Doha right now, trying to think about potentially a way forward. Blinken is about to go to the Middle East for the third time. But we see is that there's very low levels of favorability towards the United States amongst Palestinians. Only 19% overall have a very favorable or somewhat favorable view, with the most common response, nearly half, saying that they have a very unfavorable view of the United States. This is largely unchanged since we first asked this question in 2021. It's gone up maybe by a few points, but overall is still very low and not high level support. We also ask a question, which we've asked for longer, about economic relations with the United States. We do this about other countries as well, but I wanted to give you more of a trend line about how this has trended over time. What we see is that those who say that they want economic relations to become stronger is at 23%, but this is a bit of a decline. So certainly about a decade ago, 2012 and 2016, we saw a higher level of support. So this has fallen in the recent years, perhaps for some of the reasons Amaney has said, the perception that the U.S. has not really supported, the settlements have expanded and the U.S. has not said things like this. Certainly also the Trump administration coming in saw a bit of a decline here as well. So that may be part of the longer term piece, but the U.S. has very little credibility in the minds of ordinary citizens or ordinary Palestinians. If we take a look at Biden's favorability, we see again very low. Certainly, this was done before the conflict, and so it is likely to have gone down given the perception of him as siding with Israel. But overall, 11% said that they have positive views of Biden's foreign policy, both in 2021 and now in 2023. If we look to other major powers, the favorability of China appears to be increasing. So what we saw was that in 2021, 34% had a somewhat or very favorable view of China. That's increased to 43%. Perhaps the effects of COVID, that coming from China, may have driven down views of China. We're seeing this in some of the other countries we're getting initial data from, that it does seem to be increasing. So perhaps that was a low point for China, but it is something that has risen to 43% having a favorable view today. And in part, you can see that this is the longer term trend. When we ask about economic relations, 44% want stronger relations with China. This is an increase getting back to where it was before COVID in 2019, rising up to about 44%. So it was at 29% a couple of years ago, lower than it has been. But again, China's not overwhelmingly supported, but there does seem to be a warmer sense of China than the United States. If we look at Xi's favorability about his foreign policies towards MENA, it's increased to 27% from 18%. So again, kind of commensurate with the changes we're seeing for China overall. Russian favorability, we see that Russia is not particularly highly supported overall, lower than China at only 29%, saying they have a favorable or somewhat favorable view of Russia. Economic relations have been more or less constant over this time. They've moved up and down a bit, but it's returned to levels we saw kind of in 2016 and 2019, somewhere around 3 in 10, or close to a third, saying that they have positive views or they want stronger economic relations with Russia. So still a clear minority across the Palestinian community, but at the same time, it is something that has gone up slightly, perhaps since 2021, when we conducted the survey there. Putin's favorability remains largely unchanged. Again, still quite low, only 23% today, saying they have a positive view of his foreign policies. Maybe a tick up from before, but this is not too far outside the margin of error. So really relatively constant and very low levels of support, still higher than Biden, but again, only about 1 in 5, 1 in 4 saying that they have a positive view of Putin's foreign policies towards the MENA region. One of the things that we see is actually very low levels of support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have about 22% saying that they approve or somewhat approve of the invasion, with 70% saying that they disapprove. We break this down by the West Bank and Gaza. We see a bit of a difference here in terms of the degree to which people are opposed, with the West Bank being more strongly opposed and somewhat opposed. But overall, if we net this out, it is a relatively similar opinion. It's not particularly different between the West Bank or Gaza. If we turn to Saudi Arabia, we see that the views of Saudi Arabia have improved pretty dramatically in the past couple of years. It was at 24% in 2021 and has now risen to 38% in 2023. So an improving view of Saudi Arabia. That may be a bit surprising given the talk of normalization, but certainly the engagement that Saudi Arabia had shown, and perhaps the statement in terms of meeting with the PA and talking about the demands for what would be required for normalization to take place and move forward, hearing out the Palestinians may be seen as more favorable, which happened shortly before we were doing the survey. We've seen that this is in a way a reverse of a long-term trend on Saudi Arabia. That Saudi Arabia used to be viewed very favorably. Those who said they want stronger economic relations was almost 2/3 in 2012, fell all the way to 24% in 2021, and is now recovering somewhat. So the 2023 levels, similar to what we saw in 2019. So perhaps, again, a shift as a result of some of the changes in Saudi's views. Again, we might see this as kind of the sense that Saudi Arabia had not giving as much attention to the Palestinian cause over the last decade, but again, a bit of a revival now in views of Saudi. With Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, we also see an increase. Support nearly doubles for his foreign policies in the past 2 years. So again, perhaps the recent movement to take the Palestinian interests more seriously might be affecting this, but again, an increase overall. If we look at Iran, we see actually relatively low views of Iran. This may be a bit surprising given some of the Iranian statements about the Palestinian cause and the degree they're taking it forward, but we don't see particularly widespread support for Iran. Those who have a favorable view of Iran is only about 3 in 10, 28%, which is consistent with what we saw before in 2021, certainly within the margin of error, so not really a meaningful change over the last 2 years. We have seen, again, a decline in views with Iran over time. Those wanting closer economic relations is 25% today. About a decade ago, that stood at 46%, so about a 20-point decline. So certainly not a sense that that there's support for Iran. Again, this is before the conflict broke out, and this may track with the low levels of support for Hamas more broadly within the Palestinian community, linking Iran to a degree with Hamas overall. So that may be part of the decline we've seen in the past decade for Iran. Amaney A's favorability, perhaps surprisingly, is a bit up, about 5 points as it compared to 2021. Again, there is a sense that this is still very low. Only 1 in 5% or 1 in 5 Palestinians saying they have a positive view towards Amaney A's foreign policies towards the region. One of the countries we do see very strong support for overall is Turkey. Erdogan has certainly had strong statements for the Palestinian cause and a shift to try and break the embargo some time back. The Israeli embargo didn't work, but certainly, at least symbolically, suggesting strong support for the Palestinian cause. We see that Turkey's favorability is about 2/3, perhaps down slightly, but again, not too far outside the margin of error. So widespread support for Turkey compared with other countries around the world. That said, perhaps surprisingly, we have seen a bit of a decline in those who want stronger economic relations with Turkey. This peaked in 2019 at 73%, has fallen to 51%. So perhaps suggesting some of the decline we saw in favorability overall may be something that is trending downwards. But again, we do see still relatively strong support. Half of Palestinians saying they want stronger relations with Turkey. Erdogan's favorability has fallen slightly, 5 points. Again, not dramatically, still much higher than the other world leaders that we have examined in this survey. And so still, Turkey seems to be one of the more favored countries overall, with both all the measures that we have of favorability. Another country that we see fairly strong support for is Qatar. So in this case, about 6 in 10 say they have a favorable view, but this does vary pretty dramatically by Gaza versus the West Bank. Certainly, the government in Gaza has been, the funds for the government have really come from Qatar. So in this sense, we see that the very favorable view is significantly higher in Gaza than in the West Bank. So Palestinians do seem to be responsive to the situation, how the foreign countries are taking their cause and how they're supporting what they see as their own interests. And certainly Qatar in Gaza is stronger. There is still pretty strong support for Qatar in the West Bank, about half saying that they have a favorable view towards the country. We don't actually have questions directly on the United Arab Emirates, but we do have about Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed. And so what we see here is that about 27% say he has a positive, that it's positive towards his policies. This doesn't vary hugely between the West Bank and Gaza. Certainly the normalization policies of the UAE may be affecting some of this. The fact that they've normalized with Israel, leading to him having relatively lower ratings than some of the other leaders that we've seen. But again, it's one of our indications of support for the UAE more broadly. And so with that, let me stop and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Amaney and Michael, for sharing your insightful and extremely timely research with our community. Your survey obviously cuts through the heart of many pressing questions that are actively pondered in the public sphere at the moment, questions that are on the minds of anyone who's trying to think through how we got to this conflict and how we can possibly get out of it. So needless to say, there are a lot of questions from our audience, and apologies in advance if we cannot get to all the important questions you're sending us. On an organizational point, if you do have questions, please send them through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Before we get to the questions and perhaps questions, I mean, I do have a lot of questions myself, but I'll hold off on these. But let me check in with Larry Diamond and see if he has any comments and questions to share before we open it up for Q&A more broadly.
So this is very unfair to Amaney and Michael to ask them something that isn't in the data, but from what you've seen in the data and what you've gleaned, what is your sense now about how Palestinians are feeling on these issues after obviously not only the attacks of October 7th, but the really devastating, violence in Gaza since in response. And what do you think it may have done to support for a peace process and a two-state solution? Because if we're trying to find a way out of this, many people in reaction to your very important foreign affairs article and a lot of the early publication of this drew hope from the fact that there was still so much support among Palestinians for a two-state solution. So any reflections you could offer on that, I'm sure our audience would welcome.
So Larry, I'll jump in here. So thank you for that question. We've received that question. So the way I answer it is that, and I will then pass it over to Michael, is that there's two ways to look at this. The one is just based on the trends in our own surveys, is that when you have these cycles of violence and you've seen the violence invites Israeli violence in Gaza, and you see the devastation that we now see in Gaza, this has boded well for support for Hamas. It has increased support in Hamas because the discourse in Gaza is such that follows a storyline that's very similar to this, is that the world forgets about Gaza. Meanwhile, the conditions in Gaza worsen year over year. And then you see the cycle of violence between Hamas and Israel. And then you begin to see a little bit more aid, maybe a little bit more attention. Maybe people start paying more lip service to the Palestinian issue. So Hamas at least is making the Palestinian issue salient at some level. And so people are saying, well, now the devastation has been so complete almost, especially in North Gaza, and so massive that clearly if the Palestinians in Gaza were rational, they would not be more supportive of Hamas, because in a way, Hamas brought this devastation on. Had Hamas not committed the atrocious attacks on October 7th, this would not have happened in Gaza to begin with. And here, Larry, I want to say, if all the talk around peace now and the viability of the two-state solution comes out of these attacks and this counterattack, then this is basically the same pattern that we've seen in our data for years, is that when Hamas acts and there's a cycle of violence, the world cares, and people start talking about a two-state solution. So that's ultimately, if things settle, that's going to play well for Hamas. The other question we need to be asking here, Larry, is where does the PA stand in all of this? What is happening to the PA? We know that the PA has lost its legitimacy because of its levels of corruption, but equally true. Because of its levels of corruption, but equally true because of the failure of the peace process, right? Because under the PA, the Palestinians were supposed to see statehood on the West Bank, but instead what they've seen is expansion of settlers. At the eve of Oslo, you've had 100,000 settlers on the West Bank. Today, you have 750,000 settlers on the West Bank. So the future Palestinian state on the West Bank has shrunk. You have more and more of these enclaves. The PA has just basically become a government that governs its own people, increasingly authoritarian and in an authoritarian manner. I mean, the joke on the Palestinian street in Ramallah is that Palestinians used to be occupied by one authority. Now they are occupied by two. So this has delegitimated the PA. The big question for us, I think, is will these events benefit Hamas if Hamas is seen as the champions of the two-state solution and the peace process moving forward? Perhaps, but if their world order sort of stood up and said, no, we have promised these people a state for 30 years, and we have created this governing authority that was supposed to produce a state, let's also try to bolster some legitimacy behind the PA for it to be the champion of the peace process, and you begin to get people to believe in Gaza that there is a future that extends beyond Hamas that can deliver, then that might change the calculation.
So I'll add a couple of things here, and I think Amaney covered a lot of it, but I do think one of the things that we've seen, not necessarily from our surveys, but from Khalil Shikaki's surveys, our partner there, over time is that we have seen a temporary increase in support for Hamas, as Amaney is saying, after the cycle of violence continues. But that does tend to dissipate to some extent, that this isn't a long-term effect, but does seem to be kind of, as Amaney is saying, that there is these attacks, that Hamas is perhaps seen as the one challenging Israel, trying to fight for some type of change, whether that's correct or not, but just seen as the one trying to get some type of solution, perhaps, with some of its actions. Again, this is such a different conflict; it's hard to really say. It's possible that that I think support for Hamas, based on past trends, what we've seen, would go up. But I think if this conflict were if the conflict ends when it ends, that likely that would probably come back down as the conflict is no longer front and center, as there is this other process taking place. And I do think we've seen in the survey we did, 54% said they supported the two-state solution, about 1 in 10 other peaceful solutions. So the vast majority do want that. I think there's a realistic view that this is the way forward, that this is, the sense. That may not be what you'd see in the survey today, given the degree of conflict, the degree of destruction. But I do think in the longer term, there is a recognition that that is the only viable solution amongst the vast majority of Palestinians. And I suspect that even if that is changed today amidst the conflict, as people are seeing their homes destroyed, as they're seeing the frustration and have the anger, in the longer term, that probably that would come back, and that would be the view of what would be the most likely outcome to this. And that, again, it's difficult to say. Certainly the scale of the destruction will matter, the way that this conflict ends will matter. But I do think that based on what we've seen in the past, that probably it would return somewhat to closer to what we saw before than what you might see now if you were able to do a survey today.
Someone is asking whether the responses have been broken down by gender, and whether you see any interesting variations across gender in any of the salient responses to the questions you posed.
I haven't personally looked at the gender breakdown, so I'll turn this one over to Michael in case I think Michael did look at this.
So we've looked at it to some extent. We have not seen, as particularly, say, on the peace process or these questions, we've not seen necessarily the significant differences by gender, things like that. It's not something that we often see huge differences across the board. Most of the focus we've done so far is thinking about Gaza versus the West Bank. There may be some questions, that is, but I think overall on most questions we do see a relatively similar male and female response pattern. Again, some differences, but overall not a driving factor in the results typically.
And given the correlation between age and rage, if I can put it that way, do you see an impact of age on your perceptions and findings?
We have seen a bit of a difference in age. We have seen that younger people were typically a bit more supportive of Hamas overall than those who are older. Perhaps those who remember a time before Hamas took over have some sense of a different time. Also, I think to your point, age and rage, the kind of more extremist ideology of Hamas is something that may correlate with kind of a younger view of perhaps just the rage that the younger people may have, as opposed to what may in some sense change a bit over time as they age. So we have seen some of those differences. One of the surprising things we see more broadly across the region is that we don't actually see the differences by age. There's a lot of focus on the youth. Typically, again, this is not thinking just about Palestine, but more broadly, we don't necessarily see some of the differences you would think, even on things like the economy, other elements. And again, I think part of that is the way that people typically do think. And if your son or daughter can't get a job, why would you say that the economy is good, even if you do have a job yourself? And so I do think that we do see kind of fewer differences across that on technology use, on certain other things like social media. We see major differences, as you'd expect. But a lot of the attitudinal questions, typically we don't see huge differences by age. But in this case, we have seen some differences, generally like about 8-point differences on support for Hamas by age, by 18 to 29 versus those who are older.
We do have a question that's asking, kind of like pushing on the survey question that was posed regarding the possibility or the prospect of establishing a confederation between Israel and Palestine. What are the dominant or prevalent understandings of what a confederation would actually look like, as distinct from a two or a one-state solution?
So if I can jump in, Hisham, for to answer this one, first of all, it doesn't have much popularity, but the idea of a confederation is that when you take, for example, the vast number of settlements on the West Bank, that a confederation would basically give Israel authority over those settlements. Those parts of the West Bank would be under an Israeli sort of confederate sort of confederate oversight.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, will the West Bank have, or the West Bank governing authority have some kind of confederate oversight? I don't think even, some people have argued for East Jerusalem Arabs to be under that confederate oversight. I don't think that that's feasible. I think most of East Jerusalem will remain under Israeli oversight. But that's sort of the idea and the gist. And I guess that's one way of saying we can move to more autonomy on the West Bank without having to deal with the issue of settlements. And it's not very popular, because not only is it popular, because it doesn't seem to be very feasible.
We have a question regarding China's popularity or favorable views of China. Your own intuition, your own reflections on what could be driving this, and whether it is something that has been building up in the long run, or whether there have been specific short-term developments that could have been driving this.
I think that what we're seeing here is a broader trend across the region, that China, we've been looking at this more broadly than just the Palestinian context. It is a non-colonial power. It is a country that, by most estimates, has lifted about 800 million people out of poverty in the past 40 years. It has an economic model that may seem attractive to people living in the Middle East. There is a real desire there. It is someone stepping in. It certainly is, again, the degree to which at the UN or other bodies it's actually pushed for a pro-Palestinian cause is, I think, up for debate, up for discussion if that really is meaningful or not. But certainly they have had a tie with the Palestinian cause, kind of as a revolutionary cause, which fits with their own ideology for some time. They've made statements that are certainly, positive in that sense. I do think that as a serious broker for someone who could actually step in and do this, it isn't necessarily there. Maybe kind of one of the factors limiting support that they aren't seeing as much with China working. Certainly China has very strong ties with Israel as well, with its economy and other elements as well. So it hasn't necessarily broken off entirely. But what we are seeing across the region more broadly is that I think this idea of China as a kind of counterweight to the United States, certainly something that isn't particularly popular in the United States, is not popular. As a counterweight to that is part of it. Part of it is its kind of history, and part of it is these statements maybe driving some of that popularity. But again, it's not rising to the level we see in a lot of other countries. And other countries are seeing this as well. The clear majority are saying they support China. So this still is relatively lower in Palestine than it is in a lot of other places. I don't know, Manny, do you want to add on to that?
We have a question here regarding the reports about recent polling in the West Bank showing majority support for the October 7th attack. Does this mean that West Bank Palestinians accept the civilian cost of the current onslaught as the cost of resistance or liberation?
I haven't seen those polls. I've heard that there's polls that have been conducted. Until I look at the methodology, I don't want to really stand behind them. I will sort of lean in on the response we gave earlier, which is that if the Hamas attacks are seen as pushing the two-state process forward and giving some credibility to the two-state solution in ways that the PA, which has been basically sitting there for 20 odd years, it's already denounced terrorism, it's already recognized Israel, and it's gotten nothing for that, then this support is really bundled up with that. I don't think any support for Hamas coming out of the West Bank is just strictly support, quote unquote, for terrorist tactics. Palestinians are looking for, and I'm not saying that these are like, by all means, but at least trying to figure out what's being said. They're looking for some attention to the two-state solution, some movement towards the two-state solution. And it's just unfortunate that the world hasn't been talking about the two-state solution before October 7th.
I'll add a bit to that as well. I mean, I do think that one of the things we see, kind of as we were saying before, is that Hamas goes up after an attack. There is what is typically referred to in public opinion surveys or methodology as a rally around the flag effect. That basically people are hearing things and trying to say, I'm loyal to the cause, I'm loyal to the Palestinian cause, and how they interpret some of the questions, what they may be understanding or trying to figure out how that plays out. And one of the things that I think is notable is after the tragedy of 9/11, George W. Bush had 90% approval according to Gallup. We just come off a divisive election. It doesn't seem like that's something that people genuinely felt, but at the same time, they are answering to say, no, I support our country. I don't want to appear disloyal in this time. And so I do think that anytime you poll during conflict, it's very difficult to interpret how people are hearing the questions, understanding them. And in a way, if, to Manny's point, if this is seen as an act of resistance, is this something else, they may be responding to say, I support the Palestinian cause, I support the Palestinian resistance at a time they're being attacked by Israel, as opposed to really necessarily fully endorsing that. And as this recedes, I think you might see a difference in how the response patterns will go, just from a way that people are trying to answer questions. And so part of that is really thinking about how these polls, I'm not sure exactly which one's being referred to as writing, because if we were doing some of this, we'd probably try and separate this, that, even if you completely condemn Israel's response to these attacks, or to the attacks, what's happening now, what would you say about this? Is it okay that this happened? To try and give people some way to say that I'm still perhaps loyal to the Palestinian cause while the Gazans are under attack, while still showing some distance. So again, part of this is really the difficulty of doing any type of survey work in this period. So I do think it needs contextualization to really think about what is being said and what are people Palestinians trying to say through the difficult circumstances they're facing with trying to tell you actually directly, are they just saying that they're loyal to the Palestinian cause at a time they're under attack? That may be what we're really seeing is driving some of this, and that would change in a survey that happens after the conflict is over.
So, Amaney and Michael, you've been doing this for a long time, and there is always a strong tendency to look at public attitudes as particularly taken in a snapshot in time as indications of what would happen if elections were held next month, shortly thereafter. What are the pitfalls of one question is, what are the pitfalls of trying to extrapolate based on this data that, say if potential elections happens in the coming few months, that that these Hamas would not be able to perform well or otherwise, depending on how you interpret the data. And then the other question, there is another question that came in on this issue. Should we even assume, or is it fair to assume that Hamas would participate, or rather be allowed to participate in such an election?
So those are a great set of questions. Those are like questions about the day after. And I want to start off by saying, like, it really depends what the day after looks like before we can talk about what role Hamas will play. So let's just take like the 2 or 3 scenarios. One scenario is that Hamas is completely eradicated from the west, from Gaza. If that's the scenario, then Hamas won't participate in the elections. The other 2 scenarios are like where the question mark emerges. One is where Hamas is not significantly weakened and it remains as a viable political entity, or one where it is significantly weakened but nevertheless still enjoys some and enough support in Gaza and in the West Bank, where basically trying to subvert it is just going to pit any future elected government against Hamas. And we already saw that we had a civil war in Gaza back in 2007 with a similar set of sort of circumstances. So again, this is where, Hisham, I would argue to all and maintain to all your viewers or listeners, is that simply having elections for the sake of another elections on the West Bank and Gaza is not something that I'm really keen on, although I support democracy, and I know Larry's here and he's a big supporter, and we're all at the CDRL, like we all want to see more democracy and more elections. But we need to ask ourselves, well, to what end? Why are Palestinians having elections? Is it because they're going to have an independent state where they need a governing authority? is this really going to lead to a two-state solution? Or are you still going to are you voting for like the other layer of occupation that's going to govern you? And so how this election is sold to the Palestinian people is going to be very, very consequential. So, for example, if statehood is on the table and if Hamas is still viable, and the Palestinians want statehood and Hamas is seen as the roadblock, guess what? I still believe the average Palestinian and the average Israeli, in the end of the day, they're rational citizens. Hamas is going to have to make concessions to join any sort of electoral framework that meets the requirements of the international community, whether that is demilitarization of Gaza, whether that is accepting the two-state solution and denouncing terrorism, whether that is joining some kind of unity government where it's going to be subsumed by the agreements already reached with the state of Israel. But the elections have to be something part of something and a strategy that takes the Palestinians somewhere that is not simply occupation, and not simply economic blockade, and not simply new modalities of reinventing the occupation. So I would say let's wait on the elections. Let's see where things end, and let's see if we can sort of create for the next generation of Palestinians and those who will be voting hope for a better future, a future that will bring them freedom and dignity, and then we can start looking at what the electoral landscape will look like.
Okay, so I think this is a great segue for the next question, which is the fact, it's not necessarily a survey question, but it could be, in the sense that, the survey does show limited support for Hamas before October 7th. And to what extent, what are the sort of like dangers of interpreting this as an indication or as a way of trying to sort of uphold this notion that, we've all been hearing in the policy circles in the US, elsewhere, terms or slogans such as eliminating Hamas, getting rid of Hamas, dismantling Hamas. And frankly, we've been hearing it for the last couple of decades, every time a war breaks out. To what extent is sort of that goal viable? And to what extent do you think that low levels of support for Hamas could push people, or maybe perhaps we shouldn't extrapolate based on this, that somehow this notion that Hamas could be eliminated from Palestinian society is actually viable? And I know it's not strictly a survey question, but both of you have been working on Palestinian civil society and Islamist movements for quite some time, and I'm curious to hear your own thoughts on that particular question, given how pressing it's been in policy circles.
So I'll jump in quickly on the specifics of the Palestinian case. Michael has written extensively about Islamist movements more generally in the region, so I'll turn that then to him. But really quickly about Hamas. As somebody who studies the Palestinian conflict that includes also Hamas, I think several specialists, myself included, are still a little bit flabbergasted by the amount of arsenal and weaponry that Hamas has under conditions of blockade. So in other words, the whole blockade and the logic behind the economic blockade is to suffocate Hamas, to weaken Hamas, to make sure that Hamas does not have access to the weapons that we are now seeing. So clearly, blockade is not working. I also don't believe the air campaign is going to work. It's going to cause terrible and more extenuous humanitarian suffering for the Palestinian civilians of Gaza. I'm not entirely sure how much Hamas has been weakened by the campaign, and I'm very unsure about what it means to start bombing in the south when we have now the 2 million people concentrated in the south. So this is all very devastating when you look at it. We know at the eve of these events, Hamas was losing popularity. If our polls are correct, Hamas's popularity will go up if it's seen as advancing Palestinian national aspirations. My hope is that we could advance Palestinian national aspirations minus Hamas. If there's a world or counterfactual where the peace process and the national aspirations of the Palestinian people were being advanced without Hamas, that is going to weaken Hamas. That essentially will weaken Hamas. Because Hamas's currency right now in Gaza and on the Palestinian street is that the PA is a failure. The PA is a bunch of losers who sold out the Palestinian cause. They've created basically the largest per capita security establishment almost in the world to govern its own people as a fiefdom and have not delivered statehood. And so Hamas is bankrolling on the failures of the PA. And, you know, and I'm not saying that maybe we could rehabilitate the PA, but if let's give it an honest chance to actually try to deliver. Maybe there needs to be some sort of leadership shift on that end. Mahmoud Abbas in our polls only has 9% support. And the majority of Palestinians believe the Palestinian Authority is a burden on the Palestinian people, and they would like to see it dissolved. So we have problems. We have problems on the Palestinian street, and this is where Hamas has gained its currency, is basically bankrolling on the failures of all the other initiatives there on the table. So to weaken Hamas, I don't think you're going to do it by bombs. I don't think that there's a military solution to this. I think there's a diplomatic solution, but the diplomatic solution is not only coming up like with a ceasefire agreement. It's really bolstering and empowering all the other groups, civil society, all the other efforts, and monopolizing on the support for a peaceful resolution to this conflict. That's the way you're going to weaken Hamas.
I agree with that broadly. I think that certainly organizationally, if you're trying to defeat Hamas, if you're trying to destroy the exact organization, you know, I'm not a military expert on this. I'm not somebody who can think about that. What I do think about is ideology. Hamas has an ideology they put forward. I don't think that bombing Gazans to this extent is going to weaken that ideology. In fact, I think it may increase the appeal as people have seen the devastation. They feel that this is a war, that this is something they want to go forward with. And I think a lot of what we see people turning to is in dire situations, they turn towards this. We've seen hunger increasing in Gaza. You know, people may be blaming Hamas, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't turn to something else that was really trying to give them an answer. And I think people do want hope. What people want basically is some hope of a better future. And we are seeing the very low levels, even before this conflict, of optimism for a better future, whether it be economic optimism or other measures. People are suffering. And I think in that environment, you do see the ideology that Hamas has of trying to, you know, justify this, create an enemy abroad, you know, just that we're not working with Israelis, we're opposed to it, we're for the destruction of Israel. That has appeal. And I don't think that possibly you can destroy that with bombs or the destruction there. I think something will replace Hamas. You know, we've seen this, that when there is a vacuum, that groups, often radical groups, come in, whether it be the Islamic State, other groups like that fill this vacuum with some type of ideology. It's often defeated in the end. Certainly, we've done surveys. The Islamic State, by the time it was well known in the region, was just despised by the vast majority of people living in the region. But I do think that trying to find a solution to this requires, as Amaney said, some time of diplomacy, bringing people to the table, showing that there is a better future that's turning away from weapons. We've seen this happen in a lot of conflicts, whether it be, you know, if you think of Northern Ireland, we've seen certainly the demilitarization of a group that was said, we can't bring this group to the table. There was an ability to find a way to bring them to the table, create a solution, create some type of path forward. I think the question is, how is that possible? It's hard to see that right now with what's happening in Gaza, with certainly the anger that the Israelis feel from the tragic attacks of October 7th. It's hard to see that coming together, but it is, I think the only future is to find a way to build that, what Amaney's talking about, the idea of a hope for the Palestinian population that can be separate from this kind of violent resistance to the situation they're encountering. And so that would, I think, be the priority to look for those solutions, to find a way to bring that, and to think about a solution that would actually demilitarize the ideology, as opposed to just trying to take out this group with probably another group with similar ideology replacing it, even if you could destroy Hamas.
There is a question about Israeli public opinion, and if you're aware of the extent to which Israeli society, at least as reflected in recent polling, Israeli society's openness to a two-state solution. I'm also aware that Larry does follow this issue closely, so perhaps feel free to chime in, Larry, as well.
I don't follow this closely. I had to Google it, but sometimes when you search, you get lucky. And so let me just say what I found in response to the question posed is that Pew, who I think we also have a lot of confidence in the quality of their surveys, has periodically asked this question in Israel about support for a two-state solution. And I'll just make 3 points and then turn it back to Amaney and Michael for final comments. Overall, the level of support in Israel for a two-state solution has declined from 50% to 35% between 2013 and April of 2023. That's when this was done. Interestingly, support was much higher among Arab Israelis in 2013 at 74%, but it's now declined by 41%. And there are the predictable correlations with ideology. The left in Israel still strongly supports a two-state solution, but it's not very big. The degree of religiosity, the more religious Jews are in Israel, the less they supported it. So I'll hand it over to the two of you with this hypothesis. If we emerge from this and can get, some distance past the cycle of violence, what is the prospect, Amaney, in particular, for new Palestinian leadership to succeed the 88-year-old Mahmoud Abbas and maybe offer some kind of vision that might, we've talked about what is shaking up Palestinian public opinion, that might shake up Israeli public opinion and say, let's re-enter negotiations. We can't go through another cycle of this violence.
Just to step back, I think, Israeli public opinion is really, really important to sort of dissect here, because if you look at which not to sort of like, this is not a blaming game, but which population is able to exercise the right to vote more frequently and fairly, it's the Israeli public. I mean, they're on average voting every year and a half. And if they keep returning these very conservative right-wing governments that are now calling for the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank and Gaza, there's no peace, there's nobody to talk peace with on the Israeli side. I mean, the one constant factor since the demise of Oslo till now has been Benjamin Netanyahu playing a key role in the Israeli strategy to acquiesce the Palestinians with the PA and build around the PA settlements and give Gaza a free hand, give Hamas a free hand in Gaza. Who cares about Gaza? Let's focus on the prize, the West Bank. Let's build that out. Let's make sure the PA is disempowered, cannot do anything. And voila, we have a perfect project where we didn't have to, we got away with settling the West Bank without having to give Palestinians a state. That didn't work. So first we need to really look at Israeli sentiment. And here I want to say that I still remember vividly a time and day when the Oslo Accords were signed, where the majority of Israelis and the majority of Palestinians wanted a two-state solution and were working on it side by side. So I'm an optimist, but I also believe what happened then is you had the leaderships on both sides. You had Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat both say, look, we had this past of violence, and we're going to move our people to a peace process and to a negotiation. And if you had asked people even 3 years before that, do you think Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat will stand on a stage together and sign a peace accord? Everybody would say, like, everybody's delusional. That will never happen. And it happened. And so leaders can pull their populations. And who on the Israeli side right now is preaching peace and reconciliation with the Palestinians with based on a two-state solution, allowing for the West Bank to have an independent state, and that can pull the population. We've seen this discourse, unfortunately, this very disastrous discourse that emerged from the Oslo Accords, which is that the Palestinians were offered everything, but they still wanted to destroy Israel at the end, really was harmful. It was harmful because that's not what transpired at Oslo or at Camp David. They had negotiated, they were in agreement on the vast majority of issues. There were differences, but nobody left that meeting saying, oh, we're going to destroy the other side. There was always this hope that those negotiations would continue, and Palestinians were very close. I want to make sure, because our younger audience doesn't appreciate the fact that we Palestinians and Israelis were almost there. We had security arrangements, economic arrangements, health and education arrangements, borders. Palestinians and Israelis jointly patrolled areas between Israel and the Palestinian territories. This was a lot of work, agreements, intelligence sharing, intelligence coordination. So to say that we weren't close is misrepresenting the past. And so I believe that misrepresentation has led all the future generations to believe peace is never possible because the Arabs will always want to destroy the state of Israel. That is not correct. The majority of Palestinians in our polls, historically and currently, have wanted to live side by side with the Israeli state. And that is a discourse we need to start showing our data that basically shows support for a two-state solution and a resolution, and hope that on the Israeli side, leaders will emerge again to talk about the importance of peace and reconciliation, and not simply about settling the West Bank and pushing out the Arabs and ethnically cleansing and ridding the land of the Arabs. So that's going to happen on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, Larry, I do believe that we have technocratic talent, even within the ranks of the PA. It may not be at that higher echelon, slightly below. We still look at the public opinion polls. Fatah has the majority of all the political parties. Fatah still enjoys plurality support. And we do have talent. It's just that we need to make sure that there's a process in place so that we can start sort of leveraging the talent that we have to lead the negotiations.
We can't thank you enough for sharing your vast knowledge, your very important research with our community, to our community. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for your questions. We obviously need to continue this conversation in an additional session, perhaps even in person before too long. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be doing this again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.